Morning. Last week we started a sermon series. Can I get those blue lights off of me if you don't mind? Thank you. We started a sermon series last week called Christian Core. We're going to be going through the book of Romans. All we did last week was really make a case for why it's best for me to shut my mouth and just go to the word. And that's really what the whole purpose of the sermon was last week, was to draw you not towards good preaching, but towards a good God, and to get us out of our own echo chambers and to realize that sometimes we don't know best and that God's way is the best way. And so we made a case for why, when we ask the big questions about creation, about life, about our purpose, that it's better for us not to speculate with our own earthly wisdom, but rather to go to the Bible. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump into Romans chapter 1, and we're really after a couple of big questions this morning. How do we even know that there's a God? And if there is a God, and if it's so obvious to us Christians, then why are there so many good, smart, reasonable people that don't believe in God? And I think those are some of the biggest questions you can ask. Is this real? Is there a God who authored the universe, who created us for a purpose, who calls us into right relationship with Him, and who asks us to live for His glory, because that is for our ultimate good? And if so, what is our posture towards Him, and why are so many people against that God? And so in Romans chapter 1, the book of Romans, let me set this up for us. We see in the book of Acts, and you also see this corroborated with just other history. Josephus writes a whole lot about this. Josephus was a Roman historian who was an officer in the Roman military, and so he was close enough to enough important people in the Roman government that when he writes a history book, we have kept it and preserved it for all of this time, because he knew enough people to be able to name drop so that we know that Josephus wrote with accuracy. And so Josephus talks about this in some detail. The Bible talks about this in some detail. But at the time that Paul's writing, the Jews have been kicked out of Rome because of what the Bible calls a great disturbance. What Josephus will say is that the Jews had caused such a stir over their own religious issues that there's religious turmoil within Judaism, because there's a whole group of Jews that have began a sect of Judaism that they're calling the Way, that would become called Christianity. And there's all of this issue between what's happening over Jesus and how Jesus is turning the world upside down, and what that's doing to Judaism, and how that's a threat to the Roman occupation. And so the Emperor Claudius kicks all of the Jews out of Rome, and that includes all of the Jews that had converted to Christianity and had put on Christ as their Savior. And as they get kicked out of Rome, they go and plant churches elsewhere. But the church stays in Rome. It just begins getting taken over by those who were not born with the Jewish background, but were born with a pagan background. And so these pagan-born Christians begin being the leaders in their church. And then years later, the Jews start coming back into Rome. And so the Jewish-born Christians come back into Rome. And now we have a problem. And it's a problem that is not unfamiliar to Riverside as a church. And so if you're a part of what I'm calling Old Riverside, you know what I mean when I talk about Old Riverside? If you're a part of Old Riverside, then you know exactly what I'm talking about here, where when you come back to your church, it feels different. And it feels like all the pagan-born Christians have just kind of taken it over a little bit, and certain things are changing. And so the book of Romans is written to two groups of people, the Jewish-born Christians and the pagan-born Christians. And Paul is reconciling both of those groups together through unity in the Spirit and through faith in Christ Jesus. And so it's with that when you open up Romans chapter 1, he spends the first 6 verses just introing himself, just explaining that he is a bondservant of Jesus Christ, that he is an apostle of God. And so not only is he writing to encourage the church, but he's writing with authority. He's writing with the gospel authority to be able to pen the words of God, because he is an apostle of God. And so in the first 6 verses, as he's introing himself, he also just gives them the gospel, and he talks about what Jesus has done for them. And it's on that basis that he's writing. And then in verse 7, he says that he's writing to all the saints who are in Rome. So if you're reading Romans chapter 1, you get to verse 7, that's about you. to all the saints that are reading this letter. And the saints are not some special venerated people. I know some religions do that. Saints just means the set apart. It means the holy ones. It means those that are God's chosen. He's talking about his church. To anybody who identifies as a Christian, Romans is written for you, and you're either on one of two camps. You're either one of those religious Christians that's coming in the church going, hey, things look different, or you're one of those pagan-born Christians that's coming in the church with all of your issues and all of your sin struggles, and all of us are together trying to reason out how God is calling us to see him and live for his glory. And so you get to verse 15. That's what we're going to pick up. We're going to cover 15 through the end of the chapter. And Paul says this: that is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. The gospel means the good news. You guys have probably heard that if you've been around church any length of time, that the gospel is just the good news message. You hear me say all the time that God is calling us to be able to see our purpose, to serve our city, and to share our story. And so another way of saying share your story is to say, tell your news, right? Give them the news. Tell them about you. Tell them what's going on in your life. Tell them how God has moved you and how God is growing you and how God is equipping you. And that is the good news message of Jesus. And so what Paul is starting out with in the book of Romans, he's setting up this argument going, I'm writing to you because what I think you need is you need to hear my story. You need to hear my news. You need to hear me tell you about how God came into the world so that he could come into my life, so that he could transform my life. And so he says, I'm so eager to preach the news to you, the good news to you. I'm so eager to share my story with you, also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentiles. And so again, he's already hinting at that the purpose of his writing is to reconcile the Christians that think that they know how to do it because they were born Jewish, they were born with the law, they know all the rules, they keep all the commandments, and the Christians that are only there by the blood of Christ, saved by grace because they were not raised in a religious environment, they weren't raised in a Jewish environment, they don't know the right way to do things. And so he says first to the Jew and then to the Greek. He's reconciling those through the gospel. And notice he says he's not ashamed of the gospel. Before we even get to the sermon this morning, it's important that we start out with the idea that Paul's posture is showing up to them going, hey, I am not afraid to tell my story. I'm not afraid to tell you how God has worked in my life because my good news is your good news. I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of salvation. First to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written. Your translation might say it is faith to faith. It is by faith to faith, that the gospel is passed on by us telling our story, faithful people sharing their story, sharing the gospel to other people so that they may become faithful people. The reason why this is so interesting to see Paul set the text up this way is because he's about to make a case that you should just already know God. That there is enough evidence in you that God exists, that there's something in you that is called for more, that you have desires that this earthly existence cannot satisfy. And so he's about to use a lot of reason and logic to just show them the proof in the existence of God. And yet he says, but the reason I'm not going to argue this scientifically, the reason I'm not going to argue this logically is because the gospel is spread faith to faith. The gospel is spread faith to faith. And so what we're doing this morning is we're going, okay, why is that the case? In other words, and this is how we answer the question, if God's so easy to see, if it's so obvious that God is real and he's working today, why are there so many smart people that don't believe in him? And the answer we're going to see in this text, what Paul's setting us up to see, is because the gospel doesn't spread through logic. The existence of God doesn't spread through logic. As much as some of us logically minded people really want that to be the case, it would be nice if we could just argue people into belief. And yet Paul's suggesting instead it spreads not through here, but here. It spreads from faith to faith. And here's why. he says, the righteous will live by faith, since the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. The reason it's hard to see God sometimes, the reason the gospel doesn't spread through logical debate and argumentation, the reason the gospel, the good news message, spreads faith to faith is because there is an active will of the evil one to suppress truth through wickedness. And so this is Paul's presentation. He goes, man, I could come to you, the zealous Jew that I am, and I can preach to you the law, and I can show you how Jesus fulfilled prophecy, and I can connect all the dots for you, but instead, I'm just going to preach to you the good news message of Jesus, because the gospel doesn't spread best through logical argumentation. The gospel spreads through fascination. The gospel spreads from faith to faith. And so he says, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, all three of those, his invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made so that people are without excuse. This is Paul saying, you can look around the world, you can look at what has been made, and it testifies to the existence of God. See, if we weren't suppressing truth, if it wasn't for our own sinful thinking, if it wasn't for our hearts desiring to go after other things, if we had eyes to see, then the invisible attributes of God should be clearly recognizable in the world around us. I'll make 4 points to that very quickly. Probably not very quickly. I don't want to get your hopes up. But I will make 4 points to that. We've spent the last 2,000 years explaining this in all different ways, and I think the current way of talking about is people are talking about there's 4 systems of evidence that we will use that testify to the invisible qualities of God being clearly on display in the world around us. In other words, it doesn't matter if you were born in a Christian home, it doesn't matter if you were born having never read the Bible, there is something in you that can see the proof and existence of God merely by looking out at the world around you. And so one of those is what we call cosmological evidence. It's the idea that when you look out at the cosmos, one of the questions you have to ask is, how did it turn into this? And what pretty much everybody agrees with is, well, there was something, some kind of catalyst, something that happened, some kind of big bang that happened. I'm reminded of one of my professors in seminary, C.L. Thomas, who used to say, they say that there was a big bang, we just say we know who the banger was. Right? And that's the Christian claim. We're not denying that there was a big bang. We're just saying that that didn't happen by accident, that there is intelligent design in the world, that something had to start from something, that something doesn't come out of nothing. So people go, well, there is this primordial ooze, and then something happened, and by a 1 in a multi-trillion chance, it somehow turned into all of this. And we go, okay, well, where did the primordial ooze come from? And we go, I don't know. You can't explain that scientifically. Right now we're talking about divinity. Now we're talking about something beyond science, just understanding that the cosmos came into existence somehow. And what any theist would argue is that something cannot come from nothing. 0 times 0 always equals 0. That you can't get something from nothing. There has to be something before the nothing. There has to be an origin, and the Bible offers to us that God is that origin, that he is the Alpha and the Omega, that he was there before anything else was here, that he is the something that created the world around us. And then you go from that to what we call the teleological evidences, which telos meaning purpose, meaning that not only did something happen, but it seems intentional, and it seems intelligent, And the more we learn about science, it's not that the more the the creation myth unravels. In fact, it's just the opposite. The more we understand science, the more so much of our sciences point towards not only did we all just end up here somehow, but it seems to be very intentional and very specific and very intricately designed, that all of this something that supposedly came from nothing didn't just happen by accident, that there is divine purpose in the creation of the human body. There's design purpose in the creation of our solar system, that our earth is perfectly set on its axis in such a precise way that the sun is the precise amount of distance away, and that all of this came together perfectly to sustain life. And if any of the millions and millions and millions of variables were even slightly off, we never would have happened. And then you can zoom in. You can look in, and some of the biggest creationists who are scientists, and so some of the scientists that are the most what am I trying to say? Have the deepest faith in God, tend to come out of, at least right now, come out of the field of geneticism. Genetics. We'll go with that. That's a real word. Genetics. I remember I was listening to one geneticist speak. I'm going to keep making up words. I don't know science stuff. And he put it in computer terms, which I understand a little bit better. And he goes, man, simple code cannot create its own software code. That doesn't happen. Simple cells have this deeply complicated, deeply intricate, deeply systemized, but not formulaic. But it's random enough that it looks very intentional. Like our genetic code, our DNA strands seem to only suggest a deeply intelligent design in every single one of us. The more we know about the human genome, the more we go, man, that's not random chance. That is intelligent design. So one way to look at it would be like if you were to, I didn't wear my nice watch, but I'm thinking about, Joe, I should have asked you for your watch. Are you wearing it? Yeah, he is. Joe's got a watch on his wrist, if you don't mind me calling you. The reason I point out Joe's watch, because it's a nice watch. I'm jealous of it. It's a Hamilton, and that's the watch you wear when you like to have a nice watch, but you're not trying to be showy about it, you know? It's not outrageous, but it's nice, you know? And so if you were to take Joe's watch, which is, it's an automatic watch, it's self-winding, as you move your wrist, it winds itself up and keeps time, and those things maybe gain or lose a second a day, maybe like incredibly accurate, and so you open them up, they're incredibly complex timepieces, right? And so here's what Paul's claiming. I could maybe explain it this way. If you were to take a watch, a nice watch, totally apart, a watch like that where there's no battery in it, there's nothing. It's just all of these tiny different little cogs and wheels and springs and tensioners and little pieces of metal. If you were to take all of that apart and put it in a shoebox, then the question is, how long would you have to shake that shoebox before you open the shoebox and the watch happened to just fall back into place to where it was back together and keeping good time? And so that's kind of the idea, is if all of this is random chance, then that's kind of like taking a watch apart and going, well, if I shake it long enough, eventually all the pieces are going to fall back into place. And so you either have to decide, well, either it's just random chance, but it's that kind of random chance, like the kind of random chance that is never going to happen, but theoretically on a long enough timeline, perhaps you could shake the box and the watch comes back together and is perfectly ticking time. Like maybe on an infinite timeline, maybe, but isn't it much more likely that somebody designed the watch? Right? Like if you're walking through a forest and you see a cell phone, you see an iPhone on the ground, and you pick it up and you look around and you go, well, there's nobody in the forest. The logical conclusion then is that the phone must have made itself. Right? We don't do that. We know better. We know what intelligent design looks like. We know what it looks like to see something so perfectly engineered to serve a specific purpose. And so when you look at us, one of the greatest evidences that God's invisible attributes are clearly seen in the world today is that you and I are so intricately and intimately made by our Creator with an intelligent design. You and I have a purpose. And I think you can understand that logically. You can also just understand that intrinsically. That we can't have evolved into this place where we go, well, we're the ones in the animal kingdom that have these deep, complex emotions, and we're the ones that just kind of attribute purpose to ourselves, even though there is no such thing as ultimate purpose, because all of this is random chance. And even if you try to believe that, there's something in here shouting at you, going, you were made for more. That this kind of pessimistic nihilism, that none of this really matters and we're all just kind of floating around, so try to have some kind of meaning, and then you're ultimately going to die and none of it means anything and none of it matters and none of us are going to be here in 1,000 years and some other species is going to take over. Like that kind of logical thinking, like when we try to take ourselves there's something in us that screams out, is that it? Is that all life is supposed to be? Because there's something in here that is not satisfied with that answer. And that leads me to my next point. I forget what this one's called, so I'm going to look it up very quickly. This is evidence by desire. In fact, I'm going to read you a quote from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, he great Christian author, but he also was a great fiction author as well. He wrote Chronicles of Narnia. If you were like me, you had to read that when you were a kid. But he wrote all kinds of great books. And one of the things he said, creatures aren't born with desires. So think about that thing screaming at you somewhere deep in here that goes, man, you were created for a purpose, that you matter, that you're not just a bunch of electric synapses firing around, kind of like turning this into some sort of consciousness, and you're just kind of walking around until you're not anymore, and such is life, right? Like there's something more than that in here. You have a purpose, and that purpose is one of those desires that God's setting to fulfill. Here's how he says it. Creatures aren't born with desires unless satisfaction for that desire exists. We have a longing for which no experience in this world can satisfy. You ever notice that pleasure seeking arouses and awakens desire, but never satisfies them? And so I think I can keep going, but I think you guys get it, right? Like there is these desires that we have. And so if your desire is for safety and security and you go seeking that out, there's ways that we can have that. If your desire is for affection and for love, if your desire is for sex, we have a natural desire for sex. And God has given us all the things in the world to be able to satisfy that which desires us. So why is there something in here that longs for more? Why do we have something in us that craves something that nothing on this planet is able to satisfy? Why are there people, and Solomon in Scripture is a great example of this for those of you that are familiar with Solomon in the Old Testament, but even if you're not familiar with that story, you probably know it yourself. Why is it that the people that seem to have everything end up in their life going, man, none of this fills me? None of this makes me happy. None of this is where I find my true peace and inner joy and true purpose in my life. And so all of us are aware that the more we seek to fulfill our desires in the world, the more empty we feel, because we were created for something more. We have desires put in us that nothing on this earth can satisfy, because we were not born just to walk this earth. You were born with an eternal destiny. Lastly, I would say there's moral evidence that God's invisible attributes are clearly seen in the world around us. And tell me if you agree with that every culture and every civilization has come up with some kind of idea of right and wrong. And I know there's plenty of people that go, well, that's just the product of evolution. Right? That we have evolved to be this kind of supreme race in which we now have empathy for animals, and we don't want to hurt animals, and we don't want to hunt and gather for our food, because we've evolved to this place where we feel bad about that kind of stuff. And I want to challenge you. Isn't there something? Because isn't this true that every civilization since the beginning of man, no matter how separate they are from other civilizations, while we don't always agree exactly what right and wrong is, every civilization has come up with a system of right and wrong. They've all come up with a system of morality, and most of the time it's pretty consistent with other civilizations and with other cultures, no matter how much time or how much distance spans those cultures, that the basics of right and wrong are hardwired into us and not the product of evolution. And so one way that you would think about that is think about man, I hesitate to even talk about this, but think about something heinous. Think about child abuse. Think about sexual abuse, something like that. And I challenge you, do you really believe that that's wrong because we as a people, we as a species have just decided that that's disadvantageous for procreation and for the human race going forward? Because that's how evolution works. That's the idea of evolution, is that whatever right and wrong we've come up with is just really a product of our species deciding how to best serve ourselves for the future generation. I would look at that and go, no, there's something deeper than that. There's something deeper than that goes, no, that's just wrong. It's just wrong. No matter how you cut it, it's not me trying to game the system so that the human species can live on. There's something in us that says even when people desire that there's something wrong to abuse and to take advantage and to coerce and to demean and to oppress people and to assert ourselves over other people and to take what's not ours. There's something in us from a moral place that cries out that we are more than just the product of primordial ooze evolving over a long span of time. And so we can logically do this all day. I could spend hours on this just talking about how there's all of these signs that God has given us that points to deep and incredible intelligent design, that we have a creator God that has purposed this earth for us, has created us for a purpose to live in harmony with him. And so Paul is asserting that point. He's saying the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen. His eternal power, his divine nature, clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. You can look around and you can understand. And the result of this is you have no excuse. So to everybody who goes, well, I wasn't raised in a Christian home, I didn't hear the gospel, what Paul is pointing out, and if you're a religious person, wait till chapter 2, he lights up all the religious folk in chapter 2. So you can, we're about to read a list of sins in chapter 1 in just a minute. We're going to read this list, and all the religious people in the room are going to be tempted to feel a little bit smug. And you're going to kind of be like, oh, yeah, man, look at how good and religious I am. That's what bad people do, and I'm not one of the bad people. And then you get to chapter 2, and Paul flips it, and he takes his gaze off of the pagan Christians and turns it instead to the Jewish-born Christians. And so instead of talking about, hey, I know you were raised in sin and mess and madness, but there's something in you that cries out to something more, then he shifts his gaze and he looks at the religious people, and he tells them, he goes, look, I know you were raised with the law, and I know you think you've got this because you know all the commandments and you've got them all memorized, but you're just as guilty as these guys. And so we're getting to Paul drawing that great conclusion: all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But in order to get there, he's looking at these worldly people, these pagan-born Christians, and he's letting them know, hey, you're without excuse. You're without excuse. And I know you weren't raised religious. I know you don't know a lot of scripture, and I know that you're still growing in your faith, but the evidence that God is alive and working in your life is around you and in you. It is clearly seen for all of those who have eyes to see. And so that mess that you're dealing with, you are without excuse. For although they knew God. So here's the question. So how do we know that there even is a God? And Paul says, man, one, just logically, you can look around. You can see the evidence of a creator God just in creation. And then the next thing we should be asking is, okay, well, Paul, if it's so obvious, if everybody's supposed to know, if everybody is without excuse, then why do I know so many good people that are very intelligent and very reasonable, and they have deep, complex understanding of philosophy, and they've studied scriptures before, and yet so many of these people walk away from the faith and deny the existence of God? Why are there so many smart atheists if God's invisible attributes are so clearly seen? And here's Paul's answer. And again, this is not my answer. This is what Paul says. Paul says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile. So they knew God, they just didn't glorify God. And that's most of us, right? Like sometimes we know, man, we know when God's tugging on us. We know when his Spirit's working on us, and he's calling us to be transformed. He's calling us to not conform to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And that's later on in Romans. We understand when God is calling us to change, and yet so many of us go, yeah, I don't like that. Well, God, if I was God, that's not how I would have done it. Well, I mean, God, if you really want me to live that way, I just don't know how I could live for you and still accomplish my goals. And so I'll let you fill in the cracks, but I'm not going to let you have my life. I'm not going to be transformed by you. I'm not going to surrender myself to you. And so although we know God, we, in our own desire to glorify ourselves, and our own desire to sit on our throne and not allow God to sit on our throne, on our desire to be gods, on our desire to make ourselves big, on our desires to fulfill our own purpose and to eke out our own meaning and value in life. Because of all of that, we knew God, we just don't want to glorify God. There's a lot of people that just like the spotlight. And so when God blesses them, they like to talk about how hard they worked, and they like to talk about how they were able to grind it out, and how they were how they made something of themselves. And so there's so many people out there that although they know God, and a desire to not have to admit that we're only here by the grace of God, that you're not really as smart as you think you are, that what you have isn't the result of all of your effort and all of your hard work, but is rather the result of a good creator God that wants to bless you with nice things. And because we don't like that, because that threatens our selfish ego, we know God, we just don't glorify God. And so because of that, our thinking becomes futile. In other words, we just stop logically thinking about it. We stop looking around the world and go, you know what, there's way too much evidence of the invisible God. I used to think that when I was in preaching school, really right before and then shortly after preaching school, anytime I got asked to speak somewhere, it was on the subject of apologetics or Christian evidences. I love, man, and all the stuff that I talked about, the invisible qualities, the scientific evidences, that's not really my jam. I love the historical evidence. I want to go into the archaeology. I want to talk about manuscript evidence. Like, I came out of preaching school just convinced, like, man, if everybody would just study Christian evidences and we would all just see that there's so much abundant evidence that God really is who he says he is, well, then that ought to just shut all the atheists up. And that's what I thought. And so I would always just show up being like, man, like, let me show you this evidence. Let me show you this archaeology. Let me show you this bit of history. Let me explain this to you in a way so I can kind of get rid of all the doubts. And you know what happened? A lot of atheists just didn't want to talk to me very much anymore. And you know what else happened? A lot of Christians just didn't want to talk to me very much anymore, because it turns out you can't argue your way into faith. That even though there are so many invisible attributes that are clearly on display, you can look around the world and you can see the proof and existence of God. We don't disbelieve in God because of lack of evidence. We disbelieve in God because we want to glorify ourselves and we want to live a different life than what God calls us to. And so he says, they know God, but their thinking becomes futile. Logic isn't going to work. Reason isn't going to work. Trying to prove it to them isn't going to work, because we don't want to hear the good news. We don't want to hear the good news because in our sinful thinking, it sounds like bad news. It sounds like God's going to have to take me off of my focus and off of my idols and off of my fleshly inclinations and off of my desire to serve myself and please myself and esteem myself and put myself on a pedestal. And as God keeps trying to call me away from that, it's much easier for me to just deny all of that and intentionally become darkened and futile in my thinking. He says, their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Supposing to be wise, they became fools. The next verse says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, exchanging the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like immortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. In other words, they stopped worshiping the Creator and they started worshiping the created. They stopped worshiping the author of the blessings and they started worshiping the blessings themselves. Does that not sound like the culture we live in? They stopped offering up sacrifices to he who wants to provide for them and bless them and give them good things, because they became obsessed with just holding on to the good things and worshiping the good things and taking the good things and elevating them to the status of God. And now they no longer worship God, they worship the stuff that God gave them. Now's a good time to stop and ask, where's your focus right now? What are you running towards right now? What's that thing that you're obsessing over? What's that thing that you're passionate about? And you might see a glimpse of yourself in this text. You might be somebody that you know God, but there's these really big, really enjoyable idols in the way. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe you're infatuated with somebody. Maybe you found somebody that they're not God, but you're still telling them they're perfect as if they're God, right? And every time we try to make somebody else our God, they end up failing us, and the relationship gets really difficult because they're never going to be a good God to us. They might be a good partner, but they're never going to be a good God to us. And so as long as we worship them as if they're God, we're only ever going to have strife and conflict in our relationships. Or maybe you're somebody that you esteem yourself so much that you're one of those people, you idolize beauty and you idolize looks and vanity. And so the result of that is what happens? You never really feel pretty. You always feel a little bit ugly. You always feel like you're not good enough. Maybe you idolize success. You want to have that title. Or maybe there's a certain bank account number you're trying to get to because you think that's what success looks like. And then what happens? You never feel successful. You're always chasing something. If I could get to that level, and then once you get to that level, you move the goalposts and you still feel small. And you live with this imposter syndrome. Every time we set for ourselves up an idol, we turn something else into God instead of worshiping God. We end up going after this stuff, and it ends up making us feel worse. And the reason I point that out is because this is what God does in response to this. Our maybe religious culture has taught us that God's response to unrighteousness is like, all right, well, you messed up, so now I'm going to send you to hell. Now I'm going to punish all of you. And that's not what this text says. What he says is, I'm just going to hand you over to the hell you've created for yourself. And that stings even worse. This is what he says. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. If you're somebody that you idolize sex, tell me if this is true. If you know the people, and maybe it's you or maybe it's somebody else, but they idolize the lust of the flesh. And so their goal is, can I get with that person? Can I sleep with this other person? And so when you idolize that kind of carnality, when you idolize sex, and this is what we're about to see spelled out in some pretty graphic forms here, when sex or carnal relationship or just gratifying your own lust, when that is your God, and look, let me make sure there's no little ones. Any little ones in here? Okay. When sex is your God, and sex and power and money, those are the three big ones in American virtues. So we got to hit on all of these. But when you make something like that your God, what happens is you always want more some way. And so it's either I want more partners, or I want more frequency, or you want the volume, or you push yourselves to extreme desires and extreme edges. And so now sex with my wife isn't good enough. I want sex with this person. I want sex with these people, and sex with the opposite gender isn't what I'm after anymore. I want to fall into deeper desires and more perverse ideas. And here's my point. No matter what sin you put in there, no matter what your idol is, when you make something else your God, it will not be enough to satisfy you. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take the natural goodness that God gave you, and you're going to bend it and twist it and push it so that you get more out of it, because you're still trying to be satisfied in the thing that was never designed to satisfy you in the first place. And so this is what happens in their culture, and I would argue it's very much a great example of what our culture looks like here in America. He says they exchange the truth of God for a lie. They worship the created things rather than the creator. And then God's response to that is he gives them over to that in the next verse. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And so you'll see the word natural there. Here's all I'm going to say about it is what we call natural, what Paul is referring to as natural. He has this idea in his head that there is a natural way that we're to be in relationship with one another. And I would argue that the nuclear family is, by design, the healthiest thing to support and to want to pour into in our culture and in our churches. There's a book, Soft Patriarchs, and he was the first guy who really did the research on this. But maybe you grew up hearing the statistics like, well, you know, the divorce rate in the church is just as bad as the divorce rate amongst non-Christians. That Christians get divorced at around 50%, non-Christians get divorced around 50%. And so Christians don't seem to have the right idea of what relationships look like because they have all the same problems that the non-Christians have. And then in the book Soft Patriarchs, the author, he did the same research. He just asked the follow-up question. Because the research that came up with that statistic was based on, have you ever been divorced? Yes or no? Okay. Are you a Christian? Yes or no? And then by that, they go, oh, look, it looks like Christians get divorced at the same rate. And then what he did is he just asked the follow-up question. How often do you go to church? How involved are you? And specifically to the fathers of the household, how involved are you in your church? And what we've discovered, what all of the evidence shows, it is if you grew up in a home where dad was the spiritual leader of his household and he brought mom and the kids to church every Sunday morning, like if that's your upbringing, then you have the highest chances of marital satisfaction. You have the lowest chances of spousal abuse or child abuse or sexual abuse in your home. That the children and the wives of these kind of men have the highest happiness ratings, that's not the right way to say it, but statistically tend to have more satisfaction and tend to say that their lives are happier and more joyful than those that grew up in a single mom household, grew up in a fatherless home, or grew up in some kind of other version of what family is supposed to look like. And so when Paul suggests to you that there is a natural way that we are to be in relationship, he's not shaming anybody, he's not demeaning anybody, he's not elevating certain sins as more problematic than other sins. All he's pointing out is there is a natural way that God formed Adam and Eve to be in the garden. And when they sinned and they got away from that, they started taking all of the things that God gave them, elevating them to the point of God. And then what happens as society does that, it's never enough. We will always push the boundaries and we will always look for other ways to live our lives, hoping we could get the satisfaction that is only achieved in a life that glorifies God for his glory and for our good. And so his language here, this kind of pushing the idea of success and the idea of money and the idea of sex and the idea of respect and the idea of honor and just pushing all of these to these really twisted extremes is what Paul is suggesting. That's what happens when you deny God as your creator and start worshiping the blessings of God as if they are God. The response of God is not to go, well, you just messed up. There's no grace for you. Now you're going to hell. The response of God is going, okay, I'm going to let you have it. And what you're going to discover as you bend, as you take things from natural to unnatural, as you push yourselves into these other ways of trying to live your life, what you're going to discover is I'm not sending you to hell. You're bringing hell down around yourself. You will now live a life where the very thing you're chasing is the very thing that you will always want and never be satisfied, because there is no fulfillment and satisfaction outside of a life that accords with God. And so he says, they will receive the penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. Does this not sound like the country and the culture that you live in right now? Just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, God gave them over to a depraved mind. God's going, you want it? You want to be your own God? You want to try to reason out your own purpose and your own existence? I'm going to give you over to that. And this is what happens. So that they do what ought not to be done. They do not do the things that they're called to do. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They are slanderers. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanderers, God haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. So we've got everything from sexual sin in the most extreme forms all the way down to not honoring your mother and father. If you read through this list a couple of times, you're going to find your thing. Like there's something on this list that equalizes you with anybody else on this list, okay? We're not one of those churches where we go, no, you're fine. There's no such thing as sin. Go and let live. But we're also not one of those churches where we demean certain kinds of sin in order to excuse our own because it makes us feel good when we can beat up on the person 2 pews behind us, but we leave feeling pretty good. That's not us. What we go is, man, if I read this list a few times, I'm going to find something on this list that's me. I am the person that wants to deny the glory of God so that I can seek my own glory. And I am that person that will choose to worship the created thing rather than the creator. And if I keep going down this list, I'm going to find plenty of things that I too am guilty of. And Paul's entire point in writing this is by the time you get to chapter 2, by the time he says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, there's something in here where you go, well, I guess I'm one of those. I guess I'm part of the all have sinned because there's things in here that I do not do very well. And so he says, this is just, all of this is. All of these things, these are not the result of just evil people trying to abuse and hurt other people. These are the result of selfish people, like me and like you, selfish people that just thought our way was better than God's way, that we could do it however we want. And so we choose to deny God, to diminish God, to make God small in comparison with our big problems and our big issues and our big desires. We make God small, and God's response to that is, I'm going to give you over to that, and you're going to spend a season finding out what it's like living a life outside of a relationship with me. He says they disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy. And when I look at our polarized, angry, sick, demoralized nation that we live in, that's what it looks like. It looks like a bunch of people that just have no more love for other people, and they have no more grace and mercy for other people, that the further we get into trying to think that we know better, and it's our way or the highway, and the more we deny God so that we can make ourselves God, the less room we have for grace for anybody else that would do something so scandalous as disagree with us because we know so much. And so he says, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only, let me look at that. The NIV says deserve there, and that's an interesting word. I'm just noticing that. Your translation, I think literally we would translate it in English to they are worthy of death. And so what he's saying here is that they know God's righteous decree. They know that God promises us all of this stuff is worthy of death. And so what he means by that is that's its merit. That's what it profits you. It's not valuable to you. It's only the only return you're going to get in investing in that kind of lifestyle is spiritual decay. It's going to eat at you. It's going to take something from you. What he's trying to point out when he says this is worthy of death, it's the worth of this, the merit of this is death. As he's pointing out to his readers, he's going, this is not an appreciating asset. This is a depreciating liability, right? It's not your house that appreciates, and if you make your payments on time, it's going to be worth something for you one day. It's like your car. You make all your payments on time, and it's worth less and less and less every year. It ends up costing you way more than it's ever going to be worth, right? It's not an asset. It's a liability. It's not appreciating. It's depreciating. He's saying the value of this, the value of this lifestyle, the worth of this lifestyle has a negative gain. It's going to cost you. It is worthy of death. It deserves death. They not only continue to do these things, they know this. They know it doesn't work. Let me ask you, with whatever you're struggling with, whatever sin problem you have, are you still convinced it's going to make you happy? Or do you know better? Because here's the thing. I'm not going to, because this is going to end up on the internet, and then people are going to make angry posts about us. But I could point out to you exactly which sins on that list I struggle with. And here's the thing. I know I struggle with it. I know that I shouldn't, that there's certain attitudes, there's certain egos, there's certain ambitions, there's some pride that I know. I said I wasn't going to list mine, and then there you go. This isn't the service we live stream. I can say what I want. No. I know I struggle with these things, right? And here's the thing. I know they don't lead where I wish they led. I know that the more I try to platform myself, it doesn't lead to happiness and peace. It leads to a lot of loneliness and a lot of imposter syndrome and a lot of wishing I was better than I am. Like, I know that my sins do not profit me in the long run. I know they don't lead to peace. They might be happy for a moment. There might be fun for a moment, but they don't lead to joy. They might make me feel safe and secure because I'm controlling my own destiny for a moment, but they never let my soul rest and let my soul feel peace. I might have temporary security, but I don't have eternal peace. And so we know that this is true. I want to ask you, think about your sin. Tell me if this is not true. Although they know that God's righteous decree is that these things do not profit you anything. They only lead to spiritual death. We know that, and yet we continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. You want to know when a society is, when a society is desperately in need of God, is when it's not only that we do a lot of dirty things in darkness. It's not only that we have secret sins that we don't want anybody to find out about. It's when we start putting the sin on display. We start becoming really proud of our sins. We start acting like our sinful attitude is the way that people are supposed to be. And then when we take it a step further, and now it's not enough that you allow me to be as sinful as I want to, but now it's that now we start celebrating it in other people. Now it's not that, you do you and I do me, and if I want to live this way, I can, and only God can judge me and you can't tell me that. It becomes, not only can you not condemn me of my sin, but if you're not applauding other people who struggle with the same sin, then you're just as guilty. Right? And that's where our society's become. We are now the people who, we don't only practice these things, we're not even ashamed of the sin that we practice, but we also approve of those of other people when they practice it. We celebrate sin in our culture. We celebrate gratifying a life that makes us God, even though we know it doesn't fulfill us and it doesn't make us happy. And we think if we can just get a big enough mob, if we think we can just move culture enough that all of culture wants to sin in the way that I sin, then maybe I'll feel okay. And then maybe I won't feel empty inside. And then maybe I can finally justify this and finally accept that this sinful practice is the way that God designed me to be. If only I can get enough people to buy into it. And what he says is, not only do they continue to do these things, but they approve of those who practice them. And so here's my point to you. How do we know that God's there? Well, Paul's saying it's obvious. You know. There's something in here that is calling you to a life of purpose, that's calling you to glorify something bigger than yourself. Okay, well then why do so many people not believe? Not because they don't know, but because their heart has been darkened. They've turned away from the truth of God. It's not a head issue. It's a heart issue. It's a heart that we have that wants to love and worship other things rather than God. And so we deny what we know to be true in order to go after what we wish was true. Which is why Paul makes the point, I preached you the gospel, the good news message. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it has the power to save you. It's the gospel of Jesus. It's relationship with Jesus Christ, because the righteousness of God is passed faith to faith. I wish I could logic you into it. I wish I could argue you into faith. I wish that we could all pray together. God, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Help my understanding not be futile. Deepen my knowledge of you, God. Like, I wish that was enough. But what he says is, because it's not a head issue, it's a heart issue. Instead, all we do is we preach the gospel. And we spread the gospel faith to faith. We preach the good news message of Jesus Christ. We tell everybody that they were endowed by their Creator, a purpose and a calling, that there are works that God has given them to do, that there is what the Bible calls peace that surpasses understanding, that you don't have to game and look for and seek out your own security, that by the power of the Holy Spirit, by the grace of God, there is peace that surpasses understanding, that you don't have to keep trying out every worldly pleasure in order to finally find a little bit of happiness, but you can exchange your happiness for eternal joy, what the Bible calls the inexpressible joy of the Lord, that there is peace that surpasses understanding, there is inexpressible joy, there is purpose in a life that accords with God. And it's not that you don't know that, it's that you desire other things. And so my message to you this morning is very simply, yes, you can know that there's a God. You got to ask the right questions. You got to open your heart up to the very idea of belief. I think I have one more quote for you. Let me see if I wrote this down. I know I thought about it. Philosopher William James, who is a very postmodern, non-Christian philosopher, and he said this almost as a pat on the back to postmodernism. He said, in determining what we believe, more important than evidence is the will to believe. That was his submission to the world. In postmodernism, this idea that there is no truth and your truth is as good as my truth, and we can all just kind of believe what we want. And in order to make that case, he argues what we believe is less determined by the evidence than by the evidence itself than what we want to believe. That what we believe is not determined by evidence. What we believe is determined by our desire. See, the problem with him, and everybody pats him on the back for contributing to this postmodern philosophy, the problem with that is that Paul said the same thing 2,000 years ago. That 2,000 years ago, Paul's making the same case. That God's invisible attributes are clearly seen in the world. The problem is not that you can't see that there's a God. It's that you don't determine what you believe by evidence. You determine what you believe by what you want to believe. And if you want to deny there's a God so that you can keep making yourself God, so that you can keep feeding that idea that you're really that important and that you're really that smart, if you want to do that, you can do that, because what you believe very often isn't determined by logic and reason. It's determined by your desire. It's determined by your heart. So what I'm going to do for you, and what I believe Paul is doing throughout the book of Romans, is it's a book that is designed to turn your eyes off of you and get you to see who God is. Because if I can show you that you were made to desire something that nothing on this earth can satisfy, if I can show you that in him is the fulfillment of your desires, that he is your treasure, that he is your reward, and that's not a reward that you have to earn, that's not a reward that you can buy, that's not a reward that you have to be smart enough to be able to reason out so that you can kind of be enlightened in your understanding. That's a reward that is freely given to you by the grace of God, made possible by the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, that Jesus went to the cross and died so that you could die to your old self, be raised up in newness of life, so that you can be in relationship with your Creator, because it is in him that all of your desires are fulfilled, and it is in Christ Jesus that your treasure is discovered. Your purpose is found in living the life that God calls you to live. You just have to want it. You just have to decide. You just have to believe. At the end of the day, Paul says we could reason this out and we can point to the evidence, but the righteousness of God is preached by the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus, faith to faith. That we display our faith, we share our story, we tell people about Jesus in such a way that they begin to believe, that they begin to trust in God, and as they give their life to faith in Jesus Christ, that they will finally feed the desires that are not found anywhere else. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I want to invite you to that. I want to invite you to just consider believing in him and trusting in him, and just consider that his way is better than your way. His invisible attributes are clearly seen. You are without excuse. And so the best thing I can do is preach the gospel, for it is the power of salvation. If you're here and you're not a Christian, we want to invite you to step into faith. We want to invite you to die to your old self and put on Christ Jesus as your King, as your Savior, as your sacrifice for your sins. Be in right relationship with him, because the life he has for you is simply better than the life that you're living right now. If we can do that for you, if we can pray for you, if there's a way that we can encourage you, we'd ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.